So part two is ending the UK's contribution to climate change. I said at the beginning, you need to get to zero carbon to end your contribution to climate change. That's what we've committed. We've actually committed to go a bit further than that in the UK. We've set a really tough zero carbon target that also covers all the other gases. It covers methane, it covers nitrous oxide, fluorinated gases, and it covers all the sectors of the UK economy. It covers international aviation and shipping as well. It's a really tough target, and it goes into the UK Climate Change Act. So it is a tough target going into a tough framework. And the idea with that is we think that is what the UK should do in this. We think that is the UK's role internationally, is to really do it properly and to demonstrate what doing it properly looks like. And also, I think we feel a bit empowered to do that because we've had this 10 years of trying to cut emissions, of having some success in cutting them, and of seeing that the sky doesn't fall in. So a really momentous point for the UK when this went through. It went through Parliament in June, so this is a new target. The committee advised on it in May, so quite a quick response from the government to put it in. And I should say as well, it came from a government request. So after Paris, the government said to the committee, do we need to do more? Is the target we have enough anymore, or should we be doing more? We have the IPCC report now on 1.5 degrees. Have we got the right level of ambition? And you ask a difficult question and you get a difficult answer, and the answer was that, yeah, you've got to have a 100% reduction instead of an 80% reduction. I've talked about this already. Also, we'll just pick out, that's the target for the UK as a whole, 100% by 2050. For the countries within the UK, for Scotland and Wales, who have their own climate legislation, we actually think a different target is appropriate. So Wales has a large agriculture sector, it has a lot of emissions from sheep in particular, and it has very low potential for carbon capture and storage. And we think those two things together mean that actually Wales can't get quite as far as the rest of the UK with a comparable effort. So actually this translates to a 95% reduction for Wales by 2050. Scotland, however, also has an agricultural sector, but it has a lot larger land area, giving it greater potential for forestry and for biomass production, and it has good carbon dioxide storage potential. So actually we think Scotland can get to beyond 100% by 2050 and should be aiming to get to zero by 2045. So this kind of, I hope, demonstrates a bit the way the work is done. So this is not just taking a target from the science and from the international requirement, but it's very much saying, well, what is the highest possible ambition? These are the words the Paris Agreement uses. What's the most you can do in the different parts of the UK, reflecting our individual circumstances? And again, that's the notion in the Paris Agreement, that you have these suitable national contributions that add up to an appropriate whole. And as I say, it goes in the Climate Act, so it is legally binding. It requires politicians to now have a set of policies to go with it. And that's where the hard work is going to be in the UK in the coming years. Interesting thing with this is that we saw actually in Scotland, for example, an immediate response to this. So they set the new zero carbon target, and then immediately a couple of days later, they cancelled removal of aviation duty, for example. So aviation tax had been going to be reduced to zero. Having set the zero carbon target, they cancelled that change as being inconsistent with the target. So we had some very quick, although somewhat marginal changes in policy. The challenge now is to have the full programme to come in, but it's a sign that politicians are taking this seriously, I think. I showed you this curve earlier, and I just want to emphasise the difference between CO2, which globally needs to get to zero around 2050 for a 1.5 degree pathway, and all greenhouse gases. When you include the other greenhouse gases as well, your emissions are higher, the challenge is greater. The global curves, consistent with 1.5 degrees, get to zero around 2070. So the UK target we've just set, which gets there in 2050, is considerably ahead of what the world needs to do. That is very deliberate, and that is a change from how the UK Climate Committee has looked at this before, and we think is much better representative, again, of the notion of Paris, the way the Paris Agreement is supposed to be implemented. And three things I want to say on it. One, we can do it. We've published the two reports that we have on the net zero target that set out in a lot of detail how the UK can get to zero emissions. Two, we think it's right for the UK to get there ahead of the world as a whole. You know, we've been burning coal since the 1800s. We have a very high historical emissions. We have a carbon footprint that goes beyond our borders in terms of the goods that we import. And we're a rich country, right? And a rich country has more capacity to achieve this. And then finally, and this is the most important one, we think it really matters. We think it matters what the UK does. We're only 1% of global emissions, but the symbolism of the country that was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, setting this target and pursuing it matters. The symbolism of taking the climate talks seriously, taking the Paris obligation for different efforts seriously matters. And the UK is aiming to then host the UN climate talks at the end of next year, which are crunch talks. These are talks when we are looking to increase the global ambition and get closer to these trajectories. So we think it matters for the host of those talks to be doing the right thing. And then kind of more practically, it matters because we need to develop policies in new areas. We need policies, we need business models for things like carbon capture and storage. We need to show that we can roll out electric vehicles across the economy. And doing that sort of thing in the UK first, we might not be the place where all these technologies will be developed, but we can do the policies well. And we think us doing that then makes it a lot easier for others to act and to follow and to get to the same place a short period after. And I think a really interesting thing to think about in the New Zealand context is, well, what can New Zealand do that will impact globally? Because the thing that affects climate change is the global emissions curve. We think that this is a key thing for the UK, to set the right target, to bring in the right policies to meet it, and to hopefully then have those as things that we can do, we can export overseas. Just to bring that to life a bit, this is the same curve, but this is now on per capita emissions terms. So actually, although the total curve was going up, per capita emissions have been roughly stable since 1990 globally. And still, they still need to fall very quickly. Yeah. If we put the UK curve on there, you can see why we think we're a useful example globally, because we've come down from being roughly double the global average to being about where the world is on average. So we think us showing that we can meet this curve is a useful example globally, because it is quite a similar challenge. Clearly the components of it are different, but at a macro level, what we're trying to do is comparable to what the world needs to do. And we were really encouraged actually to find that we could, in the UK, go further than the global 1.5 degree pathways. The scene is really tough, right? We came into the project thinking that these 1.5 degree pathways were just not going to be plausible. But actually, when we tested them in a UK context, which we understand very well, we found that actually you can do it. It's hard, don't get me wrong, but it can be done with sufficient political will and with a real commitment to making it happen. And then the other thing is to say there are net zero targets popping up around the world. The UK and New Zealand are not the only ones. Sweden were one of the first to set it. They actually set a target for 2045. Slightly different to the UK, doesn't include aviation and shipping, for example, and it allows more scope for removals within the country than the UK target, for example, or offshore mitigation. France was in a race with the UK to set a net zero target. It set it a day after us, so we won that race. Denmark, Norway and California have they have targets that are not quite as clear. The UK and the French and the Swedish ones are probably the cleanest versions. California has an executive order rather than being a proper law. Norway has a law, but it has two parts to it. One is about what they achieve with international effort. One is in the UK, is domestic. And they have a mix of these, whether they're CO2 only or all greenhouse gases. Crucially, New Zealand is not alone in considering a new target. The European Union, I think, will probably set one early next year. It is quite advanced in discussion, but a difficult thing, obviously, bringing all the different parts of Europe together on that. And then, interestingly, lots of other countries that you might not necessarily think of have their own net zero targets as well. Again, these are they're not written in the law, so we thought about them on a different basis, but they're embodying the same level of ambition in terms of getting to zero by 2050 or earlier. And again, details matter here in terms of how they count the land sector clearly and that sort of thing. But it's just as a sign that there is a growing global norm to set zero carbon targets. So the key thing then is how do you actually do it, right? This is maybe an interesting thing. The UK is, carbon emissions are embedded throughout our economy. Everything you do, every activity involves carbon emissions in one way or another. So getting to zero is hard. But you can tell the story reasonably simply. This, I should say, is a kind of synthesis of a 500-page report with all the annexes, etc. I'm going to do it in a minute or so. It starts with electricity supply for us, and we've actually made a lot of progress there already. We have about half our electricity now from zero carbon sources, which was only about a quarter around a decade ago. That all needs to get to renewable and nuclear generation. It all needs to get to low carbon generation. But we have loads of other uses of energy that are a bit harder to decarbonise. It's not that tricky in a way to switch out from gas and coal to low carbon sources, but decarbonising gas that we use in all our homes, oil in our cars and all our other transport means, and all the different fuels that we use in industry is more tricky. And it means we're going to need to roughly double the size of our electricity sector. So actually we need to quadruple our low carbon electricity supply. That then will allow us to electrify various parts of these. And we think electrification is the second option. The first option is efficiency, but with efficiency done, electrification looks like it's at the top of a hierarchy of how you will deal with these things. So where you can, we think we should be aiming to electrify. But we can't do that everywhere. So we need to bring hydrogen into the equation in the UK. We actually have a sector at the minute, quite a small sector in the UK, producing hydrogen, but it's all brown hydrogen. None of it is low carbon. Clearly needs to switch to be low carbon, green hydrogen. That could be through electrolysis, produced with electricity and water. It could be using carbon capture and storage. And we'll need a lot more of it. We think we need to roughly increase the size of that sector tenfold. That will make it about the same size as the current electricity sector. So this is a major new industry that we need to develop in the UK. And that basically will allow us to hit some of the hard to reach stuff in here. So some of the bits of industry that, for example, need a direct flame, so you can't just electrify. Some of the heavy transport like ships that are too expensive to put a big battery in because of the distances and the weights they have. And some of the heating, particularly we think at peak. So to provide all the UK's heating at peak times on a very cold winter day, to do that all through electricity would be very difficult with the low carbon sources, which tend to be less flexible. So hydrogen looks like an interesting option for us there. That's still not enough, so then we need to also be capturing CO2 and using carbon capture and storage, burying that, for us most likely under the North Sea, from bits of industry particularly, and probably also some of the hydrogen and electricity production. And again, peak energy is a big issue for us when we're thinking about this. You've still got a few bits left over there, notably aviation actually. We've not really touched it with any of these solutions. And you can't do that much. You can only cut it a bit, aviation. So that brings us then onto the land sector. And in the UK, we never really talked about the land sector that much in an 80% target world, but when we start talking about a zero target, land becomes very important alongside energy. And it can help us because it can pull CO2 from the atmosphere. That's the fundamental thing there. We think we need to roughly treble our level of planting in the UK to draw down more CO2 from the atmosphere. And alongside that, we need a major shift in agricultural production into producing more bioenergy. That bioenergy, actually, we think you can use it in aviation a bit probably, but actually we think the most important use of it will be with carbon capture and storage, so that you are, as you grow crops, drawing CO2 down from the atmosphere and then burying it so that it's permanently removed from the atmosphere. We think that's the best way of using the bioenergy and some of the land, the scarce land resources that we've got. That reflects that if you pull the CO2 down and then you bury it, you're capturing almost all of it. So you're really getting the biggest bang for your buck. If you try and convert it into a biofuel, you generally will lose carbon at the stage of converting it, and that conversion process is quite difficult. So we tend to favour, in the long run at least, bioenergy being used with carbon capture and storage rather than just as a biofuel. And this will get you most of the way there. You will need to have some things at the margin where you cut demand for some things that are hard. Aviation cannot keep growing at the rate that we've seen it grow. We think it can grow a bit, but it has to be moderated from the growth that we have. Some of the industrial products, not just energy efficiency, but also resource efficiency is going to be important there. So using less steel, using less cement in applications where we can use less. And also diet change. We haven't talked about diet change until we started talking about zero carbon in any serious way. But again, once you start having a 100% target, it's so hard, you have to start having conversations you hadn't had before. this doesn't mean everyone has to be vegetarian, but it does mean that we have a 20% reduction in lamb, in beef, in dairy consumption in the UK. We've seen that then is matched in terms of the production in the UK, and that reduces our carbon emissions, or methane emissions, our nitrous oxide emissions, and at the same time frees up a chunk of land that we can use for this stuff over here. So kind of that consumption change is a necessary part to square the circle in the UK to get to zero. If you don't have any change on the consumption side, the types of stuff we're talking about in the land sector is just pushing emissions elsewhere and not dealing with the global problem. So you have to bring a consumption lens into this as well. The other couple of things I want to say about this is, I've said a few times, it's very hard. And we need to start now. You can't, the kind of transformations we're talking about here, they have to start now if we were going to get there by 2050. 30 years is not a long time in terms of the scale of change we're talking about here. It has to be government-led. Businesses and individuals will be the ones making the changes, but it has to be led by government. And government has to keep an eye on the integrated nature of this. That's really important in the UK, where we're looking at the energy sector and a lot of cross-cutting vectors. Carbon capture and storage being used in hydrogen production, which is being used in electricity production, which is being used in various homes. And so you need to have regulations and you need to have policies that are designed with that coordination in mind. And then the other is that people need to be engaged in this. It's very easy to draw this on a slide and imagine it's kind of all technological. We estimate that about half of the reductions in here involve some pretty serious change from individuals, from people out there in the economy. They need to drive different cars, drive them slightly differently, charge them slightly differently. Right? They need to heat their homes in slightly different ways and choose different technologies to put those in. Using a gas boiler in a central heating system versus using a heat pump within that system and integrating it is a different way of doing things. So people, even if they're not changing their diet, a lot of the other changes require people to be doing things. Oh, that's the end of that section.